Hi, this is Alex, and if you love music, well, you've come to the right place because we're all about albums. I have been thinking about what I said on a prior video about my total exposure to music. That is that I have listened to approximately 10,000 albums. Now, obviously, that's a gross estimate. But then what I brought up was Apple Music has approximately 70 million songs in their library as of February of 2021. If we guesstimate that approximately 10 songs are on each album, we would be left with approximately 7 million albums in the Apple Music library. That's a pretty big number. And I said that maybe I've listened to up to 10,000 different albums in my lifetime, which seems like a lot, but when you compare it to how much music is in the Apple Music library, we come down to 0.15% of all the albums out there. So it's really just a pittance. So because I've only listened to 0.15% of all the albums out there, obviously my musical knowledge is limited. So what could I have done differently? Could I have listened to a lot more albums and had a better music appreciation, a bigger exposure? Sure, I could have done that, but let's see how I could have done that. First of all, I would say that I listen on average to an album 4 times. Now, obviously there's a range. Some albums that I love, I've listened to 20, 30, 40 or more times. Other albums that I didn't love, I may have listened to only once or twice. So I'm going to guesstimate that maybe I listen to an album on average 4 times. So if I only listen to an album 1 time versus 4 times, then my total exposure to the albums would be at this time 40,000 albums. That's a lot of albums, but again, in the grand scheme of things, this is still less than 1% of all the albums in the Apple Music library. So the question is, in that scenario, am I better for that? Am I a more accomplished audiophile? Do my opinions carry more weight? So do I now qualify for people to listen to me more? My opinions matter more? So that's the question I was trying to answer. I was thinking, does music quantity or music quality matter most? So let's take a closer look at these 2 scenarios. Typically, when I get a new album, I play the album without any judgment. I have it on almost like background music. I'm listening to it, but not really intensely. The second times through, I'm a little bit more critical. I really focus on the music, and also I will go through the liner notes as well as following the lyrics. The third time through listening to the album, I used everything I gathered during my critical listening, including reading the liner notes and following along with the lyrics. What happens is I am usually more connected with the album. I have a greater understanding of what the artist is after, and typically that increases my enjoyment. So in the new scenario, when I only listen to the album 1 time, what I would probably do is listen to it much more critically. I would look at the liner notes, and I would probably also look at the lyrics and try to get what the artist is saying. I will not have listened to the album just to get some overall gestalt of what I feel about the album, or on any subsequent listens when I'm more relaxed and hopefully having more enjoyment with the album. Although I'm listening to the music isn't there for me to enjoy, but rather for me to evaluate. So here the advantage is that using this method, I can listen to 3 more albums than I could with the way I'm listening to albums currently. So the question is it better to focus on one artist, become more knowledgeable about the artist, possibly form an emotional bond with the artist and grow to really enjoy the album? Or is it better to be exposed to more music? That is, discover new artists as well as new musical styles, as of course I'd be listening to 4 times as much music. As the years have gone by, I have realized that yes, I do wish I would have been exposed to more artists to have a greater appreciation of the big musical world out there. Again, over 7 million albums on the Apple Music library. And yet, what I would rather do is have a connection with my music library rather than having a lot more albums on my shelf. I consider myself a music collector, which I think is a lot different than an album collector. Now, with albums, I include both CDs or vinyl, any physical media. So the way I see the difference is I buy music titles because I truly want that album. It's an album I'm going to enjoy and listen to several times, rather than having a larger music collection and potentially having a much more collectible album library. So how have I made that decision? Well, I have to go back to when I started collecting albums. That is when I was a young teenager going through middle school and into my high school years. During that time period, I obviously had very limited amount of money to be expendable to spend on buying albums. Because of this, I had to be very selective in the type of albums that I was going to purchase. Because of this, I made sure that I bought an album that I truly liked, that I have listened to, maybe at a friend's house or on the radio, or secondarily, it's an album that is from one of my favorite artists. These are the albums that I typically would buy. I really shied away from buying an album just because it had a huge hit song on the album. About the time I graduated from high school, I had approximately 300 albums in my collection. Obviously, not a huge number, but not inconsequential as compared to friends of mine. Now, I would say these are the 300 albums I would never give up. These are the albums that I truly love, that I have bonded with, that I have an emotional connection with, and I truly enjoy. These albums I would always take with me, even if I had to whittle down my collection because I had no more room to spare, I would still keep those first 300 albums of mine. And now, some 40 plus years later, what's happening? Well, I still listen to these 300 albums probably more than any other albums in my collection. I believe if I would have had an extra 1,000 albums in my collection, I would not have been any happier than I was with those first 300 albums that I purchased. I believe this idea can be extended into the purchase of audiophile albums today. So what do I mean by that? These albums are typically significantly pricier than the regular version of the album, and the question is this money well spent? So the question here is, does quality in this situation really make any sense? The first thing we have to take as a given is that the audiophile pressing is better than the original album. Now, I know that's not always true, but let's, for the argument, take that as a given condition. So if this better sound quality connects you better with the music and gives you more musical enjoyment, well, maybe then the price is justified. This would be just like the previous scenario. We would own a lot fewer albums, but at the same time, we probably would be happier with these select albums. So here are two such examples. First, we have a vinyl example. This album I never did own. This was out prior to me collecting albums. And so when I heard this was a great pressing and I enjoy this artist greatly, I decided to take the plunge and put down more money for this album. And lo and behold, this is Buddy Holly's first self-titled album, and it is a winner. It sounds fantastic. If you love early rock and roll, you'll be blown away by the sound on this album. The same goes for CDs. Here is an example. Most of you know I love Amy Mann, and this is an album I already own. I own a regular CD quality album, which is called CD Redbook, and I think it is quite excellent. However, this is the SACD version, and that stands for Super Audio CD, and this was developed by Sony. This has higher resolution than a typical CD, and therefore you're going to get a deeper, fuller sound. And because I love Amy Mann, and this album brings me even closer to her music, I feel that the price of this CD is justified, at least for me. Something else to think about these pricier albums, that in the long run, this may actually save you money. I know that sounds counterintuitive. How is that? Well, let's think about certain albums. There are many first pressings of albums that are, say, 10, 20, 30 or more years old, that if you had to search on Discogs and try to find a mint or near mint copy, it could be extremely pricey, especially for more popular or rarer albums. Because of this, buying the reissue audiophile version of the album is likely significantly less costly than that of trying to find an original pressing. So, in selective cases, I believe buying the audiophile reissue of an album is well worth it. So if you are selective in your purchases, you're probably a smarter shopper by buying the audiophile pressing. This is, however, different for vinyl and CDs. Typically, CDs do not appreciate in value, whereas vinyl, which is cared for, does appreciate, sometimes rather remarkably appreciate in value. I think there is a caveat to this, as there is a caveat to almost anything, and that is if you are going to purchase an audiophile copy of an album and you don't own the album already and you're not that familiar with the album, maybe it's better to buy the cheaper regular version of the album, see if you connect with it, see if it becomes a real favorite of yours, and if that happens, then go ahead and buy the audiophile pressing. Obviously, the discussion we previously had has to do if you are an owner of the music. In other words, if you buy physical media. And I'm a strong believer in supporting the artist, so once again, long live physical media. And now for last video's unknown album. The first unknown album is Peter Gabriel, and it's his first solo album, simply known as Cars by his fans. All the first four Peter Gabriel albums are just called Peter Gabriel, and people knew each album by the picture on the album jacket. This is Peter Gabriel's first solo album. It came out in 1977, and this album cover, which is quite unique, is by none other than Storm Thorgerson, who is one of the co-founders of Hipgnosis. As most of you already know, Hipgnosis is the company that does the album covers for Pink Floyd. Peter Gabriel was the leader of the progressive rock band Genesis, but in 1975 he left the band and he went on for a solo career. The solo work allowed him to experiment and try new things and flex his musical muscle. By listening to the tune on the album, Salisbury Hill, you can appreciate the maturity of the music as well as the strong lyrics. This tells us that it was time for Peter to move on from his band Genesis. The album covers a diverse style of music. It's as if Peter wanted to get everything out there. He tried every type of music there was and presented it as if this was going to be his only chance. Now, other people have done very well. Take David Bowie, even though he changed his musical styles throughout his career, each album focused on one musical style, so it can be done. Although this is not considered Peter Gabriel's best album, it does show quite a lot of promise. It also shows the courage that Peter had in leaving Genesis. Peter's also courageous in that he wanted to present the music like he wanted to, and he wasn't going to be interested in producing hit songs. The album did well in the UK. It reached number 7 on the charts. In the United States, it reached number 38. The second unknown album, I must say only one person in the comments seemed to know this one. It is called Undercurrent. It's an album that came out in 1962, and it's by the great pianist Bill Evans with his collaboration of Jim Hall, who plays jazz guitar. The album was later reissued by Solid State and then again reissued on the Blue Note label. This album has great interplay between both musicians. They both are featured on each song, which is rather nice, rather than Bill Evans, who was the bigger jazz artist at the time, take over and only be featured on each of the songs. The album has a very beautiful, relaxing sound. So if you're in a mood to listen to relaxing type, pretty background music, which is really more than background music in this case, but I would highly recommend this album. Bill Evans and Jim Hall did collaborate on a second album that came out in 1966 called Intermodulation. This album is on the Verve label. This album was produced by a well-known producer by the name of Creed Taylor, and it was engineered by none other than the legendary Rudy Van Gelder, who is probably one of the top engineers in the jazz world. And now for this video's unknown album, the first unknown album. Okay, hope you got that one. The second unknown album. Great, hope you got that one too. If you think you know the answers, let me know in the comment sections below and I'll let you know how you did. As always, this is Alex with All About Albums. Thanks for listening, have a great day, and remember, keep them spinning.